we are told that modern policing is more sophisticated than ever, data-driven, networked, equipped with computers, radios, forensic labs, and surveillance cameras that see everything. But standing in the lobby of the old Fairfield Town Hall, looking at a single wooden desk with a rotary phone and a worn leather-bound logbook, you realize that sophistication is just a polite word for distance. The desk weighs 240 pounds, solid oak, quarter sawn. The finish is worn smooth in two places, where the elbows rested during phone calls and where the logbook sat open every single day for 33 years. The phone is black bakelite, heavy as a brick. The cord is cloth-wrapped copper. When you lifted the handset, you felt the mechanical resistance of an actual bell clapper system inside, not a digital chirp. To the modern eye, this looks like a receptionist's furniture, but to the forensic historian, this was a command center that maintained public safety for 4,000 people without a single surveillance camera, without a database, without backup, and without any technology more advanced than a ballpoint pen. The system was called the Beat, but that term doesn't capture what it actually was. The town constable didn't patrol a geographic territory. He monitored a human network. His jurisdiction wasn't measured in square miles. It was measured in names, faces, vehicles, routines, relationships, and the intricate web of dependencies that held a small town together. The constable knew every car, not the make and model. He knew the actual vehicles. He could identify them by sound before they came around the corner, by the particular rattle of a loose exhaust bracket, or the whine of a specific transmission. He knew which trucks had bad brakes, which sedans burned oil, which farm vehicles were held together with baling wire and optimism. This wasn't romantic. This was a technical database stored in human memory, maintained through daily observation, and updated in real time through continuous presence. The logbook was the only written record. It sat open on the oak desk from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. Every call was logged by hand, not typed, written. The date, the time, the caller's name, the nature of the complaint, and the resolution. There were no case numbers, no incident codes, no classification system. Just the facts, in chronological order, in blue ink. The constable's handwriting didn't change for 3 decades. It was mechanical, precise, legible. Every entry was a single line unless the situation required more detail, and the threshold for more detail was high. Most entries read like telegrams. Mrs. Hadley, cat in tree, borrowed ladder from fire station, resolved 3:15, or traffic accident Route 6 near Miller's Farm. No injuries, drivers exchanged information, cleared 5:40. The brevity was not laziness, it was compression. The logbook was a reference tool, not a narrative. The real database was in the constable's head, and the logbook was simply the index. Here's what that system actually accomplished. The constable didn't just know the vehicles. He knew where they belonged. Every car had a home address, and every home address had specific vehicles associated with it. When a car appeared somewhere it shouldn't be, he noticed immediately. Not because he was looking for crime, because the pattern broke. A blue Chevrolet pickup parked behind the drugstore at 2 in the morning wasn't a data point that triggered an algorithm. It was an anomaly that triggered a question. What is Frank Morrison's truck doing here when Frank is supposed to be home sleeping because he has to drive to the grain elevator at 5? The constable didn't assume criminality. He assumed disruption. Something had deviated from the normal flow. His job was to investigate the deviation, not to punish it. Most of the time, the explanation was mundane. Frank's daughter borrowed the truck to meet her boyfriend. Frank's wife needed medicine and sent him to knock on the pharmacist's back door. Frank couldn't sleep and decided to take a drive, but occasionally the explanation was significant. Frank was meeting someone he shouldn't meet. Frank was stealing from the pharmacy. Frank was in trouble and needed help he was too proud to ask for directly. The constable's power came from proximity, not authority. He wasn't an enforcer. He was a known quantity. Because he lived in the town, ate in the same diner, bought his groceries from the same store, attended the same church, and sent his kids to the same school. He wasn't separate from the population he monitored. He was embedded in it. His wife knew your wife. His kids played with your kids. When you saw him walking down Main Street, you didn't feel surveilled. You felt seen. There's a difference. Surveillance is anonymous observation designed to catch transgression. Being seen is mutual recognition that creates accountability. The constable wasn't watching you. You were watching each other. This created a behavioral loop that modern criminology would call distributed enforcement, though that term makes it sound more technical than it was. The system worked because everyone knew that their actions would be observed, remembered, and, if necessary, discussed, not prosecuted. Discussed. And all of it was anchored to that oak desk. It wasn't just furniture. It was a fixed point in the social geometry of the town. You knew where the constable was between 7 and 11, every single day. He was at the desk, in the town hall with the logbook open and the phone within reach. If you needed him, you didn't search for him. You went to the desk. If you wanted to avoid him, you knew exactly where not to go. This predictability was the foundation of the entire system. The constable didn't chase criminals through the streets. He didn't need to. Criminals came to him, indirectly because their actions created disturbances in the patterns he monitored. And those disturbances always led back to the desk, where the logbook turned chaos into chronology, and the constable turned chronology into resolution. But the desk was just the anchor point. The real machinery of the system operated on what industrial logisticians would call zero-latency communication. That means information traveled at the speed of conversation, and conversation was constant. The constable didn't sit at the desk waiting for the phone to ring. He walked, every day, the same route, the same stops, the same conversations, the hardware store at 8:15, the diner at 9:30, the bank at 10:45, the feed supply at noon, the garage at 1:30, the barber shop at 3. These weren't social calls. They were intelligence-gathering operations disguised as routine. At each stop, the constable talked. Not interrogated. Talked. He asked how business was. He asked if anyone had seen anything unusual. He mentioned things he'd noticed himself, and waited to see if anyone had additional context. The hardware store owner might say that someone bought an unusual quantity of rope last week. The diner waitress might mention that a stranger came through town twice in 3 days and sat in the same booth both times, watching the street. The bank manager might report that someone tried to cash a check from an account that had been closed for 6 months. None of these observations were crimes. They were anomalies, data points. The constable collected them, stored them, and cross-referenced them with everything else he knew. If the rope, the stranger, and the fraudulent check all pointed to the same individual, the constable would quietly investigate. Not with a warrant, with a conversation. This is what modern law enforcement calls community policing, but that phrase suggests it's a technique that can be taught in a training seminar. It wasn't a technique. It was a structural inevitability created by proximity, permanence, and the absolute lack of anonymity. You couldn't be anonymous in a town of 4,000. Everyone knew everyone, and the constable knew everyone twice. He knew you as a citizen, and he knew you as a variable in the security equation. If your behavior changed, if you started drinking more, if you missed work, if your kids stopped showing up to school, if your car appeared in strange places, he noticed. Not because he was spying on you, but because your behavior was part of the town's operational baseline, and deviations from the baseline were his responsibility to investigate. The system didn't punish deviation. It responded to it. The constable's job wasn't to arrest people. It was to maintain equilibrium. The walking route itself was a precision instrument. It wasn't random wandering. Every stop was calculated for maximum information density. The hardware store was first because it opened early and the owner arrived at 7 to prep for the day. He saw the entire downtown area in darkness, noticed which businesses had been broken into, which cars had been parked overnight, which streetlights had burned out. The diner was second because by 9:30 the morning breakfast crowd had assembled. Farmers, truckers, the early shift from the mill. They brought information from the rural perimeter of the town, reports of suspicious vehicles on country roads, unfamiliar workers at construction sites, rumors of disputes between neighbors. The bank was third because it handled money, and money problems predicted every other kind of problem. A bounce check meant someone was in financial distress. A large withdrawal meant someone was preparing to leave town or make a major purchase, possibly legal, possibly not. The feed supply was fourth because farmers gathered there, and farmers saw everything that happened in the agricultural zones surrounding the town. The garage was fifth because mechanics saw the evidence of accidents before they were reported, saw vehicles being repaired after incidents that were never logged, saw modifications being made to cars that suggested illegal use. The barber shop was last because by 3 in the afternoon, every significant event of the day had been processed through the town's informal communication network, and the barber, who saw every man in town at least once a month, was the aggregation point for all rumors, complaints, and gossip. The constable didn't just collect information at these stops, he also distributed it. Strategic information, controlled leaks. If he wanted certain people to know that he was investigating a particular issue, he'd mention it at the diner where word would spread quickly. If he wanted to send a warning to someone without confronting them directly, he'd mention their name in a context that implied scrutiny, and within hours, someone who knew them would relay the message. The walking route wasn't just intelligence gathering. It was behavioral modification through reputation management. The constable didn't need to threaten anyone. He just needed to let it be known that he was aware. Awareness alone created compliance in a system where social capital was the primary currency, and the constable was the authority who could damage that capital simply by speaking a name in the wrong tone of voice. Return to the desk for a moment. Beneath the surface, hidden in the bottom drawer, there was a second ledger. This one wasn't official. It was never mentioned in budget reports or civil service documentation. It was a debt ledger, but not the kind that tracks money. It tracked favors. When the constable helped someone, drove a drunk man home instead of arresting him, convinced a shopkeeper not to press charges against a kid who stole a candy bar, looked the other way when a farmer's unregistered truck crossed the county line to deliver hay. He recorded it, not with names, with initials and dates. The ledger wasn't for blackmail. It was for balance. Because the constable didn't have the resources of a city police department, he relied on reciprocity. If he helped you once, he knew he could call on you later. Not for corruption, for cooperation. If he needed someone to keep an eye on a suspicious vehicle, he'd ask the garage owner who owed him a favor from 1957. If he needed information about a transient worker, he'd call the feed supply owner who owed him from 1961. The ledger wasn't evidence of malfeasance. It was evidence of a closed-loop system where social capital was currency, and the constable was the central bank. The second ledger operated on a principle that economists would recognize as reciprocal altruism. That means helping others with the implicit understanding that help will be returned when needed. But the genius of the system was that the return wasn't demanded immediately. Some favors in that ledger were never called in. They sat there for years, decades, accumulating interest in the form of goodwill. The constable might help someone in 1955 and not ask for anything in return until 1968. By that time, the original favor had been mentioned, retold, and integrated into the person's reputation. When the constable finally called in the debt, refusal wasn't just ungrateful. It was socially suicidal. The entire town would hear about it. You'd become the person who betrayed the constable, and in a system where reputation was everything, that designation meant economic and social death. So people paid their debts. Not with money, with cooperation and the constable's power, which had no legal foundation beyond a badge and a handshake from the mayor, became absolute within the social machinery of the town. Because the constable couldn't be everywhere, he built a distributed surveillance network out of relationships. The postman, the milkman, the garbage collector. These weren't just service workers. They were sensors. They moved through every neighborhood, saw every house, noticed every anomaly. The constable didn't give them badges or authority. He just made sure they knew he was available if they saw something worth mentioning. And because they lived in the town too, they had a vested interest in reporting actual problems, not trivia. The postman knew which houses had mail piling up, which meant someone was gone or incapacitated. The milkman knew which families suddenly stopped ordering milk, which might mean financial trouble or domestic collapse. The garbage collector knew which households generated unusual amounts of trash, which could mean anything from a party to a crime scene cleanup. None of these workers were paid informants. They were participants in a mutual security pact. They told the constable what he needed to know because they wanted the same thing he wanted, a town where problems were addressed before they became disasters. The distributed network extended beyond service workers. Shopkeepers were nodes in the system. The druggist tracked who was buying unusual quantities of certain medicines or chemicals. The liquor store owner noticed patterns in alcohol purchases that predicted domestic problems. The grocer saw which families were buying less food, which suggested financial stress. Teachers were sensors too. They reported truancy, signs of abuse, sudden behavioral changes in children. The school nurse tracked injuries that didn't match the explanations given. Church secretaries knew which families had stopped attending services, which often correlated with crisis. All of this information flowed toward the constable, not through formal reporting systems, but through casual conversation during his daily walking route. The system was completely invisible to outsiders. There was no org chart, no protocol manual, no training program. It was organic, emergent, and completely dependent on the constable's ability to maintain relationships with dozens of people simultaneously. The most critical component of the system was response time compression. That's the gap between when a problem occurs and when authority addresses it. In a modern city, response time is measured in minutes if you're lucky, hours if you're not. In the town with the constable system, response time was near instantaneous because the constable was already there. Not physically present at the scene of every problem, but present within the social network where the problem occurred. If something happened on Maple Street, the constable usually knew about it before the victim finished dialing the phone because someone on Maple Street had already walked to the diner or the hardware store or flagged down the constable during his route. Information moved at the speed of walking, and the constable was always within walking distance of someone who knew something. Here's the unintended genius of the system. The constable didn't just solve crimes. He prevented them, not through deterrence in the traditional sense, but through intervention. Because he knew everyone, he could see trouble developing before it erupted. A man drinking too much, a teenager skipping school, a woman with a black eye who claimed she fell. The constable couldn't arrest anyone for those things, but he could intervene. He'd talk to the man about the drinking. He'd talk to the teenager about the skipping. He'd talk to the woman, and then he'd talk to her husband. And the conversation with the husband wouldn't be gentle. The constable had no legal authority to tell a man to stop hitting his wife, but he had social authority. And social authority in a town of 4,000 was far more powerful than legal authority. Because if the husband didn't stop, the constable didn't need to arrest him. He just needed to let it be known that the husband was a problem. And in a town where reputation was the foundation of economic and social survival, being known as a problem was a life-altering consequence. The intervention system worked because the constable had time. Modern police officers respond to calls, file reports, and move to the next call. They measure productivity in incidents processed per shift. The constable measured productivity in problems prevented. He'd spend 3 hours talking to a teenager who was heading down a destructive path. He'd spend an entire afternoon with a family that was falling apart financially, connecting them with church assistance, finding the husband a second job, arranging for the grocer to extend credit. These interventions didn't generate paperwork. They didn't appear in any official record, but they prevented crimes that would have required arrests, trials, and incarcerations. The constable's invisible work was the most valuable work he did, and it was only possible because he had the time to do it and the knowledge to know when it was needed. The system also handled minor crimes in ways that modern law enforcement would consider irregular. A teenager caught shoplifting wouldn't be arrested. The constable would bring him back to the store, make him apologize to the owner, arrange for restitution through work rather than cash, and then have a conversation with the kid's parents. The incident would be remembered. The constable would mention it months later if the same kid got into trouble again, but it wouldn't generate a criminal record that would follow the kid for life. This wasn't lenience. It was precision. The constable understood that most teenage crime was stupidity, not evil, and that a criminal record was often more damaging than the original offense. By handling minor offenses informally, he preserved the kid's future while still imposing consequences. The shopkeeper got restitution. The kid learned a lesson. The parents were humiliated enough to impose additional discipline, and the constable gained leverage. He'd helped the family avoid a disaster, which meant they owed him a favor. The system had one critical vulnerability: the constable himself. Everything depended on his memory, his judgment, his relationships, his integrity. If he was corrupt, the entire system became an extortion racket. If he was incompetent, the entire system collapsed into chaos. If he died suddenly, 30 years of accumulated knowledge vanished instantly. There was no backup, no redundancy, no institutional memory beyond the logbook, which recorded only a fraction of what the constable actually knew. This was the argument that eventually killed the system. Reformers in the 1960s pointed out that the constable model was fragile, idiosyncratic, and impossible to standardize. They were correct, but they failed to recognize that the fragility was also the strength, because the system depended entirely on one man. That man had absolute accountability. If crime increased, everyone knew whose fault it was. If problems weren't addressed, everyone knew who to blame. The constable couldn't hide behind bureaucracy, shift blame to understaffing, or claim he was following protocol. He was the protocol, and that personal accountability created a level of dedication that no bureaucratic system has ever matched. And then the system was dismantled, not with violence, with promises. The promises came in the form of cars, highways, and centralization. In 1956, the interstate highway system began construction. Towns that had been isolated, 40 minutes from the next population center, accessible only by 2-lane state routes, were suddenly connected to the national grid. This felt like progress. It was progress, in a narrow technical sense. Travel time decreased. Commerce expanded. People could work in one town and live in another, but the highway didn't just connect towns. It dissolved them, because when a town stopped being isolated, it stopped being a closed system. The strangers started arriving, not tourists, transients, people passing through, stopping for gas, eating at the diner, then disappearing. The constable couldn't know them. There were too many, and they moved too fast. The database in his head, which had taken 30 years to build, became obsolete in 5. The highway brought another change that nobody predicted: commuting. Before the interstate, you worked where you lived. The town was economically self-contained. After the interstate, people started driving to jobs in other towns, other counties, other states. They'd leave at 6 in the morning and return at 7 at night. The constable would see their cars disappear and reappear, but he had no idea what they did during those 13 hours. He lost visibility into a third of their lives, And when people started working in distant cities, they started bringing back urban attitudes: anonymity, privacy, individualism, the social contract that held the constable system together, the mutual understanding that everyone was visible and accountable to everyone else, started to erode. People who spent their days in anonymous urban environments didn't want to be known when they came home. They wanted privacy. And privacy in the constable system was a threat. The second promise came in 1968, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. Federal money for local law enforcement. The grants were enormous by small-town standards, enough to hire 3 deputies, buy 2 patrol cars, install a radio dispatch system, and build a proper police station. The town accepted the money. Every town did. Why wouldn't they? The constable was 63 years old. He'd been working 70-hour weeks for 33 years. The idea of backup, of deputies who could handle the night shift, of cars that could cover ground faster than walking, it sounded like relief. But the grants came with requirements: standardization, training, reports. The deputies had to be certified by the state. The police station had to meet federal specifications. The radio system had to be compatible with county and state frequencies. Slowly, the constable system was replaced with the police system. The constable became the chief of police. The oak desk was replaced with a metal desk. The logbook was replaced with incident reports on carbon paper. The walking route was replaced with patrol shifts. The conversations were replaced with radio check-ins. The federal money also brought accountability requirements that were incompatible with how the constable system actually worked. The informal interventions, the conversations with troubled teenagers, the quiet warnings to domestic abusers, the arrangements to handle shoplifting through restitution rather than arrest, all of these became liabilities. Because they weren't documented, they didn't exist in the official record. And if they didn't exist in the official record, they couldn't be defended when someone filed a complaint. The new system required documentation of every interaction, which meant everything had to be handled formally. A teenager caught shoplifting couldn't just apologize and work off the debt. He had to be processed, charged, and sent through the juvenile system. A man hitting his wife couldn't just receive a warning from the constable. The wife had to file charges, and the man had to be arrested. The system became legalistic, bureaucratic, and far less effective at actually preventing harm. The final promise was the most seductive: efficiency. The new system could respond to calls faster. The patrol cars could cover more ground. The radio meant deputies could coordinate in real time. The incident reports created a permanent record that could be analyzed, aggregated, and used to identify crime patterns. On paper, the new system was superior in every metric: faster response time, broader coverage, better documentation, more officers. The only thing the new system couldn't do was what the old system did automatically: know everyone, because the deputies weren't from the town. They were hired from neighboring counties, trained at the state academy, and rotated through assignments every few years to prevent corruption. They didn't live in the town. They commuted. They didn't shop at the local stores or eat at the local diner except during their shifts. Their kids didn't go to the local school. They weren't embedded. They were deployed. And because they weren't embedded, they couldn't build the database. They didn't know which cars belonged where, which people had substance problems, which families were falling apart, which teenagers were heading toward trouble. They responded to incidents after they occurred, but they couldn't see the patterns that predicted incidents before they happened. The system became reactive instead of preventive. It became faster and less effective simultaneously. The training requirements created another problem. The State Police Academy taught standardized procedures designed for urban environments, de-escalation techniques, Miranda rights, probable cause, chain of custody. All of this was necessary for building court cases, but none of it was relevant to the kind of policing the constable had done. The constable never de-escalated. He prevented escalation by intervening before conflict reached the boiling point. He never read Miranda rights because he never arrested anyone unless absolutely necessary. He never worried about probable cause because he didn't conduct searches. He just asked people questions, and people answered because they knew him. The academy-trained deputies arrived in town with a toolkit designed for strangers policing strangers. They had no idea how to police a community where everyone knew everyone, and their training actively discouraged the kind of informal, relationship-based work that had made the constable system effective. The constable retired in 1972. The desk was moved to the basement. The logbook was archived. The second ledger, the one that tracked favors, was destroyed. The new chief of police didn't know it existed, and the constable didn't mention it. That ledger represented a kind of power that couldn't be transferred or explained. It was personal, accumulated through decades of reciprocal relationships, and it died with the system that created it. The patrol cars kept running. The radio kept crackling. The incident reports kept stacking up, but the town became less safe. Not dramatically, not visibly. Crime didn't spike, but the invisible machinery that had prevented crime, the early interventions, the quiet conversations, the web of mutual accountability, was gone. Problems that would have been addressed in 1965 with a conversation at the diner were now addressed in 1975 with an arrest. People who would have been helped were now processed, and the town, which had once felt like a single organism with the constable as its central nervous system, became a collection of individuals with a police force monitoring them from a distance. Compare the two systems directly. The constable system required one man, one desk, one phone, one logbook, and 30 years of accumulated knowledge. Total annual cost, one salary, one pension contribution, minimal equipment expenses. The constable worked 70 hours a week, but never filed overtime because there was no such thing as off-duty. He was always the constable. The police system required 4 officers, 2 vehicles, a radio network, a dispatch system, a station building, fuel, maintenance, insurance, training, certification, and compliance with state and federal regulations. Total annual cost 7 times higher than the constable system. The constable system prevented problems before they became crimes. The police system responded to crimes after they became problems. The constable knew 4,000 people by name, vehicle, and reputation. The police system knew whoever they happened to encounter during a shift. The constable resolved most issues with a conversation. The police system resolved most issues with a citation or an arrest. We traded intimacy for infrastructure. We gained speed. We lost foresight. We gained coverage. We lost depth. We didn't upgrade the system. We replaced a scalpel with a hammer and wondered why everything we touched looked like a nail. The psychological impact on the town was measurable, though nobody measured it. Before the transition, people felt accountable. After the transition, they felt monitored. Those are not the same thing. Accountability is reciprocal. You're responsible to people who are also responsible to you. Monitoring is asymmetric. You're being observed by people who have power over you, but no obligation to you. The constable had been accountable to the town. If he failed, everyone knew. His reputation suffered. His family suffered. The deputies weren't accountable to the town. They were accountable to the state, to their department, to their training protocols. If they failed, they wrote a report explaining why the failure wasn't their fault, and then they continued working. The town lost the ability to hold its protectors accountable, and in losing that, it lost something fundamental about the nature of safety itself. The desk still exists. It's in an antique store 3 counties away, tagged at $200. The finish is still worn where the elbows rested. The drawer still opens smoothly on dovetail joints cut in 1939. If you run your hand along the edge, you can feel the grain of the oak, dense and tight, old-growth timber that doesn't exist anymore in commercial lumber yards. The phone is gone. The logbook is in a historical society archive, sealed behind glass, unreadable unless you ask permission. and wear cotton gloves. The second ledger, the one with the initials and dates, was burned in a barrel behind the constable's house the day he retired. He told his wife it was old paperwork. She didn't ask questions. The system that the desk anchored, the walking routes, the conversations, the favors, the distributed surveillance network, the database stored in one man's memory, dissolved completely by 1980. No one alive today remembers how it worked in detail. They remember it felt safer. They remember knowing the constable's name. They remember that problems got solved quietly, but they can't explain the machinery because the machinery was invisible even when it was running. We didn't lose the technology to police a small town with one man and a desk. We lost the social structure that made it possible. The constable system required permanence. The constable had to stay in one place for decades, long enough to build the database, earn the trust, accumulate the favors. Modern police officers are rotated every few years specifically to prevent them from accumulating that kind of power, because power accumulated through relationships looks like corruption to auditors who only see the transactions, not the context. The constable system required a closed population. Everyone had to stay put long enough to become known. Modern towns are open. People move in, move out, commute to work, shop online, socialize digitally. The constable system required mutual dependency. You needed the grocer needed you, the constable needed both of you, and all three of you needed the town to function. Modern life is structured around independence. You don't need your neighbors. You need Amazon, your car, and your credit card. The constable system required patience. Problems were addressed slowly through conversation and social pressure, over weeks or months if necessary. Modern systems demand speed, immediate response, instant resolution. Arrest now, sort it out later. The oak desk weighs 240 pounds. It will outlast the metal desk that replaced it by a century. It will outlast the police station, the patrol cars, the radio system. It will outlast the memory of the constable who sat behind it every day for 33 years, elbows resting in the same spot until the finish wore smooth. Somewhere, someone bought it for $200 because it's solid, and they needed a desk. They have no idea what it was. They'll never wear grooves into the wood because they'll never stay in one place long enough. They'll never build a database of 4,000 names because they'll never meet 4,000 people face to face in a context that matters. They'll never accumulate favors because modern life doesn't run on favors. It runs on contracts, credit scores, and surveillance cameras that see everything and understand nothing. The desk is a monument to a system we didn't preserve because we didn't recognize it was a system. We thought it was just one man doing his job. We didn't realize the job was the town, and the man was the machine, and the desk was the altar where safety was maintained through presence, not force. We didn't lose the desk. We discarded the intelligence it represented, and we've been hiring more deputies ever since, wondering why the town never feels as safe as it did when one man walked the same route every day and knew every name on every door.